Recorded. Nice voiced lady there. So I usually start with asking you to confirm that you've read the consent form for the Canadian Anti-Apartheid History Activist History Project, and that you understand that we're doing this as an educational project. So your 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 story will be publicly available via website and other forms of presentation. And so if you do understand that and agree with it, would you please acknowledge that on live?
Yeah, yes, I have read it and I agree with it. Thanks.
No problem. Excellent. Well, Bill Robb, to be very familiar, um, maybe we could start with you just telling us a bit about your own personal background and whatever led you to an awareness about issues around apartheid and eventually get involved in union work and that.
Sure, I probably started in the 70s. Just I was at University of Regina, and it was a haven for progressives and lefties of every description under the sun, and that probably started me off. And then, like you, Doug, I actually had some CUSO experience, and I started working for CUSO in 1978 in the Regina office, and a lot of work around development education, and of course the international end of it as well. And CUSO had a strong program in Southern Africa. And actually, I was part of an organizing group that helped unionize CUSO with CUPE. And so immediately we were sort of starting to get into the connection between the NGOs and the unions, which I think was very important, certainly here in the West. And then in 1980, I worked through the 80s at the One Sky Education Center, Development Education Center in Saskatoon. And then I spent 5 years with Saskatchewan International Labor Program from 1989 to 94 before actually becoming a staff person with CUPE, and I played quite a few different roles with the Canadian Union of Public Employees. So, part of that focus through that whole time period certainly was South African solidarity work and the anti-apartheid work, which was common to so many non-governmental organizations, NGOs, and church groups, student groups, labor groups, unions, and so on.
Tremendous. Well, that's great. We have common paths. So amazing that we've
Yeah.
never crossed paths. I can throw out a whole bunch of names, but that's not the purpose of this interview right now. So let's get back to then where you first ran into the SAC2 Solidarity Committee and had started having relations with them.
Well, I think Ken, you were certainly part of that. You came out to the West a number of times, and so I think you were kind of the beginning of it, and and it fit into the environment and the political struggles and the development of a movement out here in Saskatchewan. So it became part of it, that South African solidarity work.
Yeah, Bill, I remember your mention of SILP. I think that's one of the most important things we remember from the SAC2 Central Committee back here in Toronto, if I call it that. The idea that four unions could get together and work on international issues was quite unique. I mean, elsewhere in the country, we work with one single union at a time, auto workers, postal workers, et cetera, CUPE in Ontario. But to have four unions at the table at the same time, each with its own interests, perhaps in Southern Africa, that was a fantastic experience. And I can't remember when I first met you, but it probably was at one of those meetings.
Yes, I think it was. And if I might just spend a couple of minutes talking about how, Saskatchewan International Labor Program got started, because that became a fundamental base. And at the beginning, it was CUSO Oxfam Labor Project. And so, it came out of progressive NGO community. And then it came to involve like the unions you're talking about. So CUPE, Canadian Union of Public Employees, Saskatchewan Government Employees Union, SGEU, Retail Wholesale Department Store Union was involved, but not on the board. Grain Services Union was on the SILP board. CUP W, Canadian Union of Postal Workers, came on, and they actually had sustaining membership so that they made an annual contribution to SILP. We had one full-time staff person, throughout the piece, and really it was quite an accomplishment, because I got to tell you, back near the beginning, it was all about helping to build the base and to connect activists and get stronger. Just to illustrate this, one of the best activists from SGU in this whole area that I'm describing, he went to their board and asked for a contribution of $100 to Oxfam, and that motion was defeated. And the very next motion was $3,000 for buttons for a campaign, and that passed with no questions. So I mean, it was sort of, that was the beginning of it, and really things went a long way from there. And I think the other thing I would say about SILP too is to connect it with your group in Toronto, but there were so many others throughout the country, Labor World in Edmonton, another SAC2 Solidarity Committee in Vancouver, Trade Union Group in Vancouver, Development Education Center, Latin American Working Group. There were a lot of solidarity groups across the country, and quite a lot of networking, which made a big difference, actually, to assist each other and to coordinate different tours and so on.
I find it extremely interesting, given my internationalist perspective, that in Saskatchewan, you had such a great impact. You really were present with that international solidarity outreach from the union to fellow workers around the world. How do you figure that was so prevalent there and so present there in Saskatchewan?
Well, I mean, there was a critical mass of activists and progressive people. I mean, that's one thing. So organizations like Saskatoon Solidarity Committee were very strong. People, you would know Michael Murphy,
Yes.
from Southern Africa. He had come back and he was working for Oxfam, and there was just a lot of different connections. But I think a big part of it, Doug, was that our approach was this. Going for solidarity, being mutual aid between forces fighting for the same objectives. The old Samora Machel, the president of Mozambique, a rough translation of his quote, but the idea being that when we were doing our solidarity work, we were also strengthening our own struggle here in Canada. And I think that became quite critical, so that then we would set up a worker-to-worker type of approach. We started building up union to union approaches, and I can talk more about that later, if you like. But I think that was a big part of it, and also it was an area where we ran into some resistance with workers here too. I would say, why are you working on this? It's a good idea, to do anti-apartheid work, but really we have our own problems here. And the same kind of conversation came up when we were doing work, say, around the North American Free Trade Agreement. Again, there was this kind of resistance. And so, we had to work on that. And so, for example, the SILP shirts that we had made up, and of course, this was the time of political T-shirts and buttons and so on too. Let's not forget that. But, the shirt said, solidarity knows no borders. And another one at that time period that people were using is, when they win, we win. And so we had to do a lot of work to talk about the global nature of the struggle. And of course, globalization as a more, well, I don't want to say advanced or developed, but globalization really did take place. And then it became very obvious, or more obvious, that what we were talking about made sense, because the world has become, as you know, extremely interconnected. But so anyway, that's some backdrop to all of that.
On another interview I did with Mike Murphy, he mentioned that critical mass of very good activists, very busy people who got involved and believed. It's for such a tiny population of Saskatchewan, it's a remarkable phenomenon.
Yeah, I know, like we would have a demonstration maybe on El Salvador or something like that, and a march, and with a population of 200,000 or whatever, Saskatoon at that time, we'd get over 1,000 people out for it. I mean, you know, it would be
Wow.
hard to get over 1,000 people out to a march right now. Although, you know, it's -24 today, so it's hard to get 10 people out.
Aye, -24. Well, yeah, we just had a +23 only 2 days ago here, Montreal.
You're softies out there.
Yeah, softies. So look, Jane, Ken, help us out here because you had the Saskatoon
Uh,
Solidarity Committee view
as
of
I
all this.
to Bill speak, there are a couple of people who come to my mind that I just wanted for the record to get on the tape. Brian Crampian in Saskatoon,
Yeah.
very much involved in the early days of that struggle, and then of course lost his life, unfortunately, in Africa, I believe.
Yes.
One person I want to ask you about, Bill, and I've lost all touch with him, Laurie Thompson, who was a CUPE activist in the hospital sector. Whatever happened, did he remain active?
Yes, Laurie did, and he was an incredible leader, that's for sure. And he ended up working within healthcare sector later on, but absolutely, he remained active and remains in Saskatoon to this day. The Saskatoon Solidarity Committee that he and Michael and Brian and myself and many other people were involved in actually did a study and put out what at the time was a very controversial pamphlet called CLC Partners in Imperialism. And, you know, that was, and Laurie did some of the lifting on that.
That's good. I remember that.
For
Yeah.
sure. And, you know, I think it's only fair to bring up that, you know, a lot of the labor solidarity work was done in spite of the Canadian Labor Congress and with, in fact, the active resistance of it. You know, if you go back into the early 80s and the 70s now, I don't know about the rest of the country. I wouldn't be qualified to comment on that, but that did change. But I mean, there was a time when you know, the Saskatchewan International Labor Program was not allowed to have an information table at the Saskatchewan Federation of Labor Convention. I mean, the resistance was like that, and you know, part of the CLC was that they felt that union affiliates should basically do business unionism and support the NDP. That was the two-pronged strategy from the CLC point of view at that time, and that anything to do with international solidarity or the International Confederation of Free Trade Unions, ICFT, or anything, that was the purview of the Canadian Labor Congress, and affiliates should not be getting into it, and certainly mucky groups like SILP and the Saskatoon Solidarity Committee shouldn't be involved either. And so there was a, you know, kind of an active resistance, but happily, I mean, I can say that we collectively won the day on that. And if you look at union affiliates in this country, I mean, they developed strong international solidarity programs, and I think that we all played a part in that. But you know, they formed committees, global justice funds, or international solidarity funds. I mean, you look at steelworkers, the old Canadian auto workers, CUPE, a number of unions, and it became actually embedded in the union affiliates, which for me anyway, was certainly one of my objectives in it, was to integrate it right into the unions. And I really feel like collectively in across the country, we had a lot of success in that. And I'm very proud of that for, you know, and with so many people and so many groups involved in it. But I think we did a good job, you know.
One
I'm
question.
interested in the paper that you say you wrote about CLC, agent of imperialism. That can you give us any other actions that you would have been doing to promote the anti-apartheid struggle out of your?
Sure.
I'm missing the initials. Saskatchewan International Labor Project, SILP. Is that right?
Yeah, you've almost got it, but program, not project
Program. Okay.
at the end. I know everybody always did that. Well, I think a lot of it helped when Bafo Nyanga came on with SAC2 in Canada, and he was based out of Toronto, and I'm sure you would have worked with him, but he came out a lot to Saskatchewan. And so I would say a big part of it was like the worker to worker part of it, Doug, where, people are meeting each other. And so Bafo, or Sticks, as he was known, and of course later became Bangumzi Sifungo, but that's another story. Anyway, he would come to labor schools, conventions, and so on. And like when I was recalling the business at the Saskatchewan Federation of Labor, for example, he spoke at what we called solidarity luncheons many times. And we would have this luncheon, and the powers that be didn't really appreciate that, because a lot of the members would get 80 or 100 or more members coming to our luncheon with featuring people like Sticks. And it was, again, building that whole movement. So there was a lot of direct contact. The other thing is that CUPE, for example, became sister unions with National Education, Health and Allied Workers Union, NIHAWU, which was one of the union affiliates of the Congress of South African Trade Unions, COSATU. Anyway, so that happened early on, probably mid 80s, I guess. And that was around the time that we set up our own Global Justice Committee nationally within CUPE. And so we had many tours of, comrades from NIHAWU, and then later on from others. In fact, CUPE twinned with South African Municipal Workers, SAMWU, of South Africa, and did some interesting, projects with them. But, people really, our workers, our members really responded, and to that direct contact. I would say that, when I look back on it, I think that was one of the key things, was developing that relationship. And it always helped too when we would have people coming in that they, if it was someone from the Postal Workers Union, for example, if we could do a workplace tour with members of CUPW in the post offices, that's where, the magic happened, when you actually had similar unions and the workers together, because believe me, there was a lot in common, even though there was incredible differences, obviously, with the struggle against apartheid.
Bill, we appreciate you raising this question of Cold War politics, because every interview we've done, that comes up in one fashion or another. Bickerton with the postal workers, Schneid with TWU in Vancouver. One person after another has made reference to the struggle we all had in CLC in those days. So we appreciate that. And you might want to go at some point, watch the thing that kicked this whole project off, the Toronto Workers History Project. Did an hour and a half interview with all of us who were involved in the SAC2 work in Toronto. And that focuses also on the Cold War politics of the day. So we appreciate anyone who mentions that, because that was our daily life.
It was part of the reality we were struggling through, that's for sure, Ken.
I'm interested as well, Bill. Obviously, times have changed and things have evolved, but what about connections with the struggle for gender rights and for Indigenous rights and environmental, for that matter? Was there any connection with the kind of work you were doing that also brought these elements in, or brought them up? Were there any linkages, for instance, between the people from South Africa and the native people and the Indigenous people and their particular struggles, and even the history of South Africa being involved, learning about the reservation system?
Sure. Well, that's a big question, but I'll break it down a little bit. Yes, there were connections, and I would say some of them played out through CUSO and Oxfam, which, as I mentioned earlier, were part of our program, and so that there. Well, again, while there were differences between the struggles of First Nations and Métis associations, etc., and South Africa, there were a lot of similarities, that's for sure. So some of that work was there. And again, it happened more through other organizations than SILP directly, because again, we tried to keep a laser focus as much as we could with limited resources on the union aspect of it, but we did support that work. Also, I would say, like around the gender issue you bring up, like I would say it was around, and I do want to talk about this before we're done too, the Solidarity Mission program that we set up. But around that time of 1990, women in Africa, South Africa, were making 1/3 the wage on average as South African men. And in Canada, I'm not sure what the numbers were, but they weren't great either. And so there was a whole pay equity issue that was really in common. And another project that CUPE did with SAMU, the Municipal Workers Union, I think was really interesting and pretty important, where they sponsored and got involved with an analysis of the effects of privatization on women specifically, because while some of it was across the board, the effects of privatization on everybody in a society, it was found that in actual fact, there was more significant, more serious negative impacts on women through the privatization of public services and so on. So that was a great project. So we were, working, trying to integrate these things into the program whenever possible. But ideally, like the last example was when the two unions were doing it together with support. So I think, that was very good.
I just want to mention one more name, if I may. One of my most memorable trips to the West in your group was when Fiona Bishop introduced me to Ron Bourgeau, who was the Indigenous leader, student at that time, I guess, who has made the connection between the creation of apartheid and the Indian Act and the reservation system in Canada. That to me was a very important part of our understanding of making some of those international links. And we've even included some of that information in this project that we're working on here by making sure we included Ron's research in that. Did you work with him at all?
I didn't. I knew of him. I didn't work directly with him. Yeah. Okay. But definitely, yeah, he was an activist of great renown here for sure. And the connections, I think, were a little bit stronger with the Métis Nation of Saskatchewan than they were with First Nations. And that's just the way it was. I mean, there was outreach in both cases, but I think that for whatever reasons, it was a stronger connection. So, for example, CUPE developed a pretty strong relationship with the Métis Nation of Saskatchewan over the years, and we did quite a bit of programming with them, and also strengthening the committees within CUPE at the same time, and our education work with our members. So, I mean, there were a lot of connections. There was some work done with the First Nations, but I think they preferred to kind of concentrate on their own focus, and I respect that.
And they were also being divided by South Africa. So I remember the regime would try to get Indigenous leaders to go from Saskatchewan to South Africa to be part of the parade of people who would come back and dismiss what all of us were trying to do. That was certainly part of the Native politics in those days.
Yeah, and the other thing to recall, and I was thinking about this in advance of this interview, but there was a lot of work being done on the shell boycott at that time. Also, there was a huge push for full sanctions by the Canadian government on South Africa, full and comprehensive sanctions. And so these were part of the political program as well, within the union movement, but it was really cut across society. And there's no question that there were, I know we had one journalist in the Saskatoon Star Phoenix who who was about as blatantly pro-apartheid as you could get and still actually write and get it published. So I mean, and he also had went on to have a radio talk show. So I mean, there was a lot of give and take debate on the left, like should someone from the apartheid regime be given a place at an event to speak, for example? Should that be free speech, or is that person a fascist and a racist who shouldn't have a voice at that? So I mean, these were questions then, and I'll tell you what, if you look south of us right now at the minute,
Whoa, boy.
the midterm elections tonight, boy, the questions of fascism are becoming very serious again, not just there, but everywhere.
Absolutely.
Just referencing some of the points that you raised earlier, Michael Murphy's thesis that was published or completed in 1985 from U of S, investigating the ties between foreign affairs, the CLC International Affairs Department, the funding, John Harker, etc. Really is a seminal piece of work that I think very few are aware of. I'm hoping to some degree through our project and the work we're doing that some of this work that sort of has been sitting collecting dust gets raised to a higher level. Even in the bibliography that we've been working on over the last couple of years, trying to find every book, article, paper reference to the Saskatchewan Solidarity Committee and the work we were doing, I think I only found out of all the academic references, one, possibly two, that even mentioned Michael Murphy's thesis, and yet so many of the academics in the little bit that's been published don't know and misinterpret a lot of what the CLC was doing because their research is thin when it comes to the trade union movement. So we're hoping that some of this work and yours is the 20th interview we've done in the oral history span, which the Library and Archives Canada are extremely interested in, will help unearth the solidarity that happened and the struggles that happened within the labor movement. And you're absolutely right. Many others have talked about how the struggles that we were part of in the 1980s in the labor movement for both anti-apartheid work, but also Central America, that the pushback, particularly that was singularly visible at the 1986 CLC convention when we defeated the International Affairs paper, that after that, what you're talking about, the whole shift of unions now taking responsibility for international affairs, just gained momentum. And the CLC never had the credibility after that to the same degree because it was shown to be so anti-communist, Cold War, all that kind of thing. But do you also recall, was Lindsay Pickett from CAW active in Saskatoon during that time as well?
Yes. Yeah, Lindsay was quite active, very progressive.
Okay. I knew him from high school in Regina.
I'm not sure, but I think Lindsay might have ended up out in Vancouver.
Okay.
At a certain
Actually,
point.
he was a couple years behind me, but he came out of the Canadian Airline Employees Association that I was part of in the early 80s before we merged with CAW.
But things really improved when Bob White became president of the CLC compared to the previous regimes, in my opinion.
Yes, Harker was more or less fired or resigned. I can't remember exactly which, but that whole era shifted dramatically. Yes.
Yeah,
yes.
Dennis McDermott crew.
Yep.
I was interested in your unionization activities with QSO because I had been promoting that, but from afar afield in a single office, you're not able to organize all that well. And I suspect Steve Seaborn was part of that when he got back to Canada as well. And I
Yeah.
think that was an important evolution in NGO union relations, because then we started seeing the unions getting these solidarity funds going, and their sort of solidarity for more organized, I thought, after that kind of thing occurred.
That's right. Steve Seaborn was part of the organizing committee. Walter Davis, Paul Graham, Lily Masson, a number of people in Canada. It was a little easier to connect, like you say, because I don't think they really had an internet back in those days. So there we were. I'll write you a letter. You'll receive it 2 weeks from now. Think about it for a week. Get back to
Absolutely.
me. And
Yeah.
2 weeks later, I'll receive your letter.
How's your Gestetner's machine working?
I hated those damn things, but
Oh
I
my
do
gosh, I
recall
got so filthy.
uh, I know it's funny to think back to that. Yeah, the photocopier was a wonderful thing.
Now, you were involved with Briar Patch as well, weren't you, Bill?
Yeah, I wrote some articles for them, supported them, and so on. But I was never actually on the board. But yeah, I mean, they were a big part of the progressive culture. They're still going, which is pretty impressive to me after all these
That's right.
years.
Well,
But
on
yeah, they
that
were a
score,
big
what
part of
happened
it.
to SILP in the end?
Well, the SILP funding base was, as I mentioned, some money from CUSA and Oxfam and from the three unions. And then we also got money through the Saskatchewan Council for International Cooperation, SCIC, which was the provincial umbrella group for all the international NGOs. And that money was originally from the provincial government. And then as one SCIC president said at one point, we really have to come up with a better model than having the state fund the revolution, which I always laughed and remembered thinking about that, because sure enough, then eventually that funding was cut off by the Conservatives. And so we lost that part of the funding base, but we still have money coming in from the Development Education Program through CEDA, Canadian International Development Agency. And then eventually that dropped off too. Now I stopped working with SILP and moved over to CUPE in '94. I think that SILP went on for probably another 4 or 5 years. So, it made it over 20 years, probably 25 years, which was pretty good. And then it just it folded because of lack of funding support. Also, I think, like I mentioned earlier, I think that part of the mission was completed. In the sense that the work was embedded in a number of the unions, and so it continued on. So it wasn't like the work stopped, but the organization stopped, and I think that happened to a number of organizations. I know the One Sky Development Education Center made 25 plus years, but then it also folded eventually. But so.
And in your view, how do you see the state of affairs in international solidarity today?
Well, I'm not quite as connected as I was, but I've been retired now for 4 years. But I do feel like it's a normal part and an important part of Canadian unions right now. And I know just the union I know the best, of course, is CUPE, who I worked for almost 25 years. Like there's an international solidarity forum at every national convention. There's a global justice committee. There's always international speakers. There's still support for sister union relationships, and there's active involvement, and it's an integrated part of the union. So I feel like it is going forward. I mean, we're so connected right now in the world, as we talked about earlier, that I'm sure it will continue. I have no doubt about that, and be an important part moving forward. So I feel it's pretty strong.
When I'm
Right.
16 years retired, and from sitting from my position, I would say that CUPE is one of the leading unions now in terms of international work. As questions like Palestine, which most unions aren't touching. Postal workers, of course, are always there. So,
Yep.
postal workers, CUPE, public sector initiatives. That's where I see it from my retirement seat.
Right. Yeah, that's good. Could I take a couple of minutes and talk about that one program that I mentioned earlier?
Oh, yes, please.
So I think it's a good example of how things had evolved through the work of these various different activists in the West and Saskatchewan particularly. But in 1988, I had pieced together 5 different funders and got to Southern Africa for 7 weeks. And I was in Lusaka, where you were based for a while there too, Doug, and met with, at that point, that was where the African National Congress had their headquarters outside of South Africa. They were still banned. And I met with 6 people from SACTU, South African Congress of Trade Unions, in Lusaka. And, we talked about the possibility, and just to back up a little bit, they did talk about how integrated they were with the developing COSATU and Congress of South African Trade Unions, which, I think that was part of that Cold War business too, trying to create a split between SACTU and COSATU and, all of that. But my direct experience was that they were all working together and they saw a role. Anyway, at that point, they did say to me in the meeting that they felt that there was a that they would look favorably on a tour with their involvement, SACTU and COSATU, and that was 88. And by 1990, we actually did do that. And so we called it the Solidarity Missions with Southern Africa. And so it involved, was just going to be a Saskatchewan program, and then it expanded. Grain Services Union had a long-standing linkage with Union Sintiab in Mozambique. So that was built into it. So one of their activist leaders from Manitoba joined in, as well as a key staff person, Walter Eberly, from Saskatchewan. And then we had CUPE, we had Saskatchewan Government Employees Union involved, including Fiona Bishop, who worked for them, but also Don Farron, who was a member. We had several different CUPE members, including a Métis activist who worked at the West Side Community Clinic in Saskatoon, was part of that, going back to your other connection that you were talking about. And Susan Stout, you folks would know her from Vancouver. I believe she was part of a SACTU kind of solidarity committee there too, and CAW was involved. Kevin Flaherty from Labor World in Edmonton, CUPE member, and also running that solidarity program. And Barb Byers, who at this point in time was the president of the Saskatchewan Federation of Labor, was part of it. And it was done with SACTU direct involvement with Bafo Nyang, or Sticks, as we called him. And of course, by this time, the Federation had changed completely with Barb's very progressive, came out of SGU. And then, I mean, it was just like night and day, it was so perfect to have that kind of support from the Fed. And so we all got involved in this, and we spent almost a year before going over there, developing the program, doing orientation sessions, people consulting with their unions. We went over the main group for 25 days, most of which was in South Africa. Apartheid was still on then. And Sticks only got thrown in jail twice on the tour, so that wasn't too bad. Once in South Africa and once in London on the way over. So it was stressful, and then, but also we had time in Zimbabwe, meeting the unions there and women's groups there, and so on. And then half the group went to Namibia, which I was part of, and half went to Mozambique. We met up in South Africa, but part of the program had been sabotaged a bit by the CLC, by the way, and this is 1990, and so we had to regroup the program, which we did in South Africa, and then we came back. It was a pretty incredible experience, I'm sure, for everybody. And then we continued to operate as a group for over a year, doing follow-up work to it. And I think that was, pretty phenomenal because, some tours by necessity or design, or both, I suppose, sometimes, would be a day of orientation. The unionists would go, they'd come back, do a report or two, and maybe that was more or less it. But we did a reciprocal tour. We had a fellow from the president of Patwa Postal Workers and others in South Africa, as well as Stephen Sandiazi. That was Malangisi Kangwani and Stephen Sandiazi from Food and Allied Workers Union. So they came over, and so we were able to have them meet different types of workers. So this is after our return. And so, it became quite a large program. And I think that really helped. That wouldn't have been possible 10 years before, like that. We just couldn't have done that. So we actually had a Zoom meeting, all the participants of that 30th anniversary of the tour. So that was pretty cool. Although in person would have been, a lot better. But so I think it's a sign of how things had evolved and gotten stronger from a program basis. And so it's good to look back on these things and to remember them. But, again, it was just so important, the impact of having people here. And I know that you folks in Toronto helped out a lot, and many others from head offices of unions. But, when you'd have a speaker come into a convention, say QP provincial convention in Saskatchewan, or Federation of Labor convention, or CLC conventions for that matter, like, it created an impact on a lot of people. I mean, that was very direct, and then people would talk with them. A lot of things happened after the speech was over, and maybe there were forums and so on. And workers here and union members were very, generally speaking, really receptive to that. And I think that over time and continuing to build those relationships where possible, and just the exposure, I think it really made a big difference. And you break down other things, maybe some racist attitudes, for example, which we're all, we grow up in an imperfect world, so everybody has to struggle with these things. And I think that a lot of those things got broken down. It was an interesting time, that's for sure.
Why don't you and Fiona and Susan Stout and others put that in writing? I know they have photographs. I know that with Susan, there'd be a lot of photographs, with Fiona perhaps as well, but you could probably put together a nice little booklet of that.
The roll call of militant, activist, progressive people that you went through, just setting that up, is very, very impressive. And you can see also the pedagogy behind it. You're without ever going to teacher college, you're way ahead of the pedagogues in terms of getting a learning experience going.
Well, it was incredible. And then, again, I think it really helped to have that solidarity perspective, that we wanted to build the movement here and support the building of the movement there, and make those connections, and as much as possible, worker to worker, and ideally union to union. So I think a lot of that did happen. I'm trying to locate the SILP files right now. Some of them are in the Saskatchewan archives, and maybe we can create a link through that. And some of them are in a box somewhere in Regina. But I do recall, Ken, that we did a very lengthy report on this, which unfortunately my NGO training got me going with evaluations and funding submission programs and reports. So there is a long report. I don't have to have a copy of it with me now, but I for sure want to deposit that with the work that you folks are doing. And I think that there would be a lot of information in there, and It's heartwarming to hear you guys talking about some of the people, that were active here, and it kind of illustrates just what a national movement it really was, even though we didn't have a huge number of resources actually.
No, absolutely. And some fairly heavy opposition. You talked about perhaps in the unions, but we were talking about big business and military, banks. We were up against a formidable enemy. I'd call them that.
Yes. Yeah, that's for sure.
Magisterial, what a wonderful presentation, Bill. Thank you so much. And you're more than well. Anybody else, another last comment or question or
I just echo your thoughts there, Doug, and thanks so much, Bill. It's great to reconnect with you. And also, each interview begs a new interview. So could you send Doug or myself or Jane a contact for Laurie Thompson if you have it?
Yes, I will.
Contribution to the Saskatoon work, especially in Saskatoon, would be really important for us to capture. He was really helpful.
And on that score, I'll preempt Jane by saying we have already made one deposit to Library and Archives Canada last year, November, December, I think it was, and we're doing another one early December this year. We intend to continue this work for another year at least, and so there's time to pull these things together. And by submitting our submissions as a package under Saskatoon's name, it stays in one reference file. It doesn't get scattered out by the different names that might be involved. So we're hoping to continue this, and I thank you again for your efforts on that front.
Well, I'd like to thank you all, and again, just say how much I appreciate the work you're doing. It's probably pretty ambitious to say the very least, but to kind of create these records of all these experiences and the struggles that we had, and the successes and victories that we had. It's so important. So 5 stars, way to go.
Thank
We
you
just
so
want
much.
to prove that Brian Mulroney was not responsible for the defeat of apartheid. That's our.
That is true.
Okay, if everybody's okay with that, I'm going to turn the recorder off at this point. And the experience has been that we always say some of the best stuff after it's off.